Rahul. Thank you, Asian Conference, for inviting me and for having me here. Since morning, I think we have been discussing a lot about the macro level issue. One can only imagine with the two hegemons in rising Asia, the implications on the mega projects that we have been discussing about. I think rightly so we are discussing about communities and the implications of the big projects. I think, to my understanding, dams are just one aspect of what we call the big or mega projects. We have other engineering structures that are coming up, enactments, also waterscape enclosures in various forms in terms of development of inland waterways. So I think that's also something we need to talk about in order to understand the impact of these kinds of projects on riverine communities. So what I'm trying to do today is to highlight three to four, very briefly, key domains that I want to locate my presentation. Issues of vulnerability has been already spoken about in relation to green developmentalism as an indicator of neoliberal riverine privatization efforts, notwithstanding the multiple kinds of commodification of projects in the name of modernity. The second aspect that I think would be very important for us to deliberate upon is the question of uncertainties and risks associated with the riverine landscapes. And I'm more interested in learning about how waterscape enclosures have an effect on local livelihoods and the common goods. The third very important aspect is a question of agency. The question of agency of the local communities based on locally grounded understandings of the surrounding nature on which these communities are heavily dependent upon. How do these riverine communities then exercise their agency beyond resistance and look for alternative adaptability means in their mundane or everyday life practices? And I think that is very important for us to understand. The agency of these communities, I also think, is also associated with the memory, the culture, performative acts or practices, folklore, and the intangible imaginary of the riverscapes for generations. The fourth important point that we need to highlight as far as the implications on these communities are concerned is the inclusionary and participatory governance. I think even in the multilateral as well as the bilateral frameworks, being a student of international politics, I think this is a very, very important aspect that we need to also think about when it comes to inclusionary participation or governance mechanisms, as far as looking at the state-centric realist approaches of development or modernity is concerned, and looking at the distributive justice of the local communities that are mostly silenced and those at the margins. I'm particularly interested in learning about the riverine communities that transcend a monolithic quote-unquote identity of a single river valley. And we are all aware that the rivers are key to the local livelihoods and the local economy in terms of fishing, irrigation, drinking water for livestock, and even for cultural and religious performances that has already been highlighted. Since we are here to discuss about the reflections and the implications, I'm going to reflect upon a few pictures and the images. This is a picture I think some of you would know, and those of you who have not come across. These are the reflections of the riverine landscapes. The picture that you see right here is a typical image of the chor sapuris, as we call it in Assamese language. We have a number of chor sapuris, more than 1,200, according to the Government of Assam report. These chors are low-lying landforms in India and Bangladesh that are particularly vulnerable to flooding during their proximity, due to their proximity to the river systems. The GBM river basin is uniquely characterized by the formation of the special form of a landscape and sandy lands within or at the banks of the river. The Brahmaputra Valley is dotted with roughly about 1,200 chors in varying sizes and degrees of permanence. And some chors are endowed with very, very fertile alluvial topsoil. I also believe, as a scholar, that chor sapuris also lie, as you also mentioned, at the confluence of culture, hybrid environments. These are ungoverned spaces, and these are unbounded spaces. The chor communities, as we also call them, the choruas. face all kinds of vulnerabilities, as we have mentioned, and they have very, very limited access to education, health services, lack of communication and transport. Yet these communities believe, this is their agency that talks about, that the river is a blessing in disguise. And they consider themselves to be the custodians of the rivers with vast amounts of knowledge about not only the collective resources and the productivity, but also about the indigenous methods of adaptability when it comes to distress times and disasters, for instance, floods and erosion. So they have a lot of coping mechanisms with the water level rising every year in different chores and chaporis. In Assam particularly, we have very active civil society organizations, so it is also how this intersection of the plight or the prejudices and also the dangers among the communities and the intersection with their agency is concerned, their social mobilization activism through civil society organizations. In Assam, we have the Chor Sapuri Sahitya Porishad, which was recently founded, has been very, very actively promoting the literature and culture of the Chor Sapuri people. Marginality of the Chor Chapuris has been one of the agendas among the civil society organizations and the activism. And of course, religion has been one of the issues here, and the practice of religion is mostly, they practice Islam, which is a very, very syncretic form of Islam, I believe, because the Chor Chapuris in Assam, they also believe that they are a mix of people converted from various kinds of tribes and castes as well. The other case I wanted to highlight, the next slide please, is the impact of what we call the green governance or the big decisions of developmentalism. This is one of the works that we have done. Go to the next slide please. On the riverine communities, we call it democratic contestation in the policy sphere. I will not go into the details of us talking about what is the Lower Subansiri project and what it is about. The paper mentions everything. And since morning we have been discussing a lot about what is the megawatt capacity, etc., etc. So I'm just going to talk about very, very important points here. That democratic contestation in the policy sphere, we look at the hierarchical relationships and the relationships of different power capabilities and political and social actors at the national, local, and international level. And I think this is very important for us because we have been talking about stakeholders, and we are missing a point on some of the stakeholders, the local stakeholders, who are very important actors to formulate the policies for governance, control, management of water resources in the name of development. We looked at the voices of different stakeholders that shaped the pro-dam as well as the anti-dam frames, where the concerns are often environmental, cultural, and displacement, forcible displacement of population. And here we argue that the pragmatic costs and benefits should also be a part of the discourses, as it involves the local communities, and it also should allow for vigorous contestation among all the stakeholders. Subansiri, as you know, is a major tributary of the Brahmaputra. The dam is under construction and lies at the border of Assam and Arunachal in Gerukamukh. You can go to the next slide, please. And one of the recent, and this is the picture of 2025, the local respondents will tell you that it's going to be operative in the next 2 to 3 years. It is not complete yet. But the fear among the local communities is that once it gets operated, during the monsoons, it will affect the agricultural fields and fishing, as most people live on the riverbanks and are very, very dependent on fishing. So this is a picture of the Dirpai village, which is near Subansiri dam site in Gogamukh, Dhemaji district, which has been affected deeply by erosion. And some of these embankments are also being built near the Dirpai village, but it is yet to be completed. Interestingly, some of the actors who are the pro-dam actors will give you a different narrative of what this is all about. The adverse impacts have been minimized, as the pro-dam actors will tell you, and the beneficial impacts have been completely maximized. The district authorities have identified project-affected families, particularly in Arunachal Pradesh, as per the provisions of the R&R policy, Resettlement and Rehabilitation of 2008 of Arunachal. In Assam, the area is covered by the dam and is mostly a forest area. But those who are really affected would tell a different kind of a story. So hence we highlighted a very, very important point that Some are informationally rich, which is the case of secrecy on social data, like geological data. So hence, since morning we have been talking about the hydrological data between two important actors, which is a macro level actor. But here I'm discussing about the social data, which is very, very important, and where local stakeholders are always being silenced as far as the social data or the transparency data is concerned. And this is one of the guidelines that the World Commission of Dams has given us: access, equity, and transparency. These are three important points that we have been talking about, and the article that we published in the recent journal article. Could you go to the next one, please? The third important case I want to discuss here is the question of Matmora village in Dhokwakhana. Matmora is known for its first geotube embankment. So what I said in the very beginning, that we have been talking about dams, but this is also one of the ways of looking at engineerings and structures as far as controlling rivers is concerned. And Matmora, those who have been in this part of Assam would know that in Dhokwakhana subdivision of Lakhimpur district, this is a geotube embankment that was in construction. The picture was taken in 2014, and the other one is a very recent one, which was completed in 2010 in Matmora, which is also known as the Sisi Tekelifuta Dike, Dhokwakhana in Lakhimpur district. And this is a very, very low-lying area, very prone to erosion, and is a very, very flooded area. Now, the Water Resource Department, so these are again the two narratives that I'm going to talk about. The Water Resources Department, Government of Assam, claims that in spite of the hurdles faced, the geodike construction was completed in all respects well before the floods of 2010, and was finally dedicated to the people of this region on 3rd December 2010. Erosion at the Matmora reach was totally controlled by the permeable measures. Once the project was completed, it was said that this has been a paradigm shift as far as sustainable protection against flood devastation by the mighty Brahmaputra at Matmora is concerned. Now there is another report which is which goes totally against this claim, the government claim, and taken out by one of the studies made by one of the civil society organizations. And this is very contradictory to what we have as far as the government report is concerned, is that once a large village, now only the Matmora remains. And locals also tell us, if you visit that area, they will tell you that towards the middle of the river to indicate where the village used to be, which means it's become less than half of what it was before, because of the kind of erosion. And the rate of erosion is such that the Brahmaputra dike from Sisi Tekelifuta to that entire region has taken the shape of a bow, which means from 2010 onwards, Matmora became very significant in the embankment history of India, since the country's first embankment using geotextile technology was constructed here. This was constructed at a very bow-shaped, eroded line using geotextile tubes. And these tubes were filled up using water sand from banks of the river. It's a 5-kilometer embankment. And the report ends with a very, very important note that what we saw in Matmora presents a very different picture of what we have in the government reports. Now, so this reflects that not much has changed in terms of the development, social development. All you see is the infrastructure in terms of roads and connectivity to a certain extent. But the Dirpai, as you've seen in the previous slide, is also one of the affected areas even now, even after the construction of the embankment. The only change that we see is the greenery that has increased in these villages, especially in Matmora. But as far as people's livelihood is concerned, there has not been a lot of change. If you do intensive field research, and if you talk to people and communities in these regions that are very, very riverine communities, so to say. So finally, I'll conclude here by saying, so what could be some of the ways to mitigate the challenges of the riverine dwellers? I think we need to also look beyond what is called the rhetoric. The chores are very, very fertile indeed and very productive, hence connectivity is very, very important. We also need the flood resilient building houses. So the next slide, if you see, the missing community Sangor, which is a very, very popular way of how they adapt to these local ways of adapting to these kinds of situations. I think these are also one of the ways of looking at local resilience and the traditional practices of building their houses and making them very, very resilient to the disasters. Embankments, as I said, are also considered as solutions, but there are also threats from land mafia today. If you see in some of these embankments that have been built in the entire region, because of the activities of the land mafia and their involvement in illegal cutting of the land, this has affected the porcupines, and these porcupines have been constructed with the government initiative to prevent erosion. The other thing that we can talk about probably and think deeply is the diversification of the economy and the livestock, like food processing industries, because alternative ways of livelihood is very important. Most of these people are dependent on agriculture, but with government support, they are also given support in terms of livestock, but the problem is in terms of the marketability, in terms of the industrial support that they really need to survive and also to support in these kinds of conditions. Skill development and capacity building has already been talked about. I think the basic infrastructure, health and medical facilities is something that that has to be looked at in terms of capacity building of the local communities and the implications. Last but not the least, I'd like to conclude here by saying that we really need to problematize perhaps the popular imaginings of the vulnerable communities and the typically reinforcing assumption of the everyday practices and how these communities integrate their local knowledge practices with the diverse forms of adaptability and resilience using technological assistance. So I think there has to be somewhere there has to be a syncretic way of looking at the intersection of their knowledge, their resilience, and the adaptability of the local communities if we are to understand the implications of the riverine problems associated with the communities in this particular basin. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.